Cool. Yeah, it's great to be back here at Napier today. I'm going to talk to you about a presentation from Data to Defence. Oh, wow, that's come up a bit strange. I'll tell you a little bit about myself to get started. So I originally studied at Napier. I think Bill kind of alluded to that. I graduated back in 2012. I'd done computer systems and networking. But I actually done a couple of classes, a couple of modules with Bill, and never really looked back. Ended up doing security. I joined a company called Vacta. I've been defending some of the UK's biggest brands for the last 12 years. I worked for a managed service provider called Adharma. My experience is primarily across Splunk, the Microsoft stack, and CrowdStrike. So that's my background. So I use that in our SOC environments. And my sort of career has been built upon building, improving, and operating security operations centres. When I started working in 2012, security operations centres were still sort of emerging at the time, so it was a great opportunity and a great experience for me to get stuck into that. I've been an incident responder, so part of my role has been getting involved with customers and helping them with business email compromise, ransomware, and insider threat as an example of some of the incidents that I've been involved in the past. All very, very interesting. All can be quite stressful as well when you're put on the spot with a customer. For me, I'm passionate about protecting organisations. I think that sounds a bit cliche almost, but I consider myself one of the good guys. I like to be able to help companies so that they can concentrate on what it is they want to do and not have to worry about cybersecurity. I'm dedicated to simplifying security and reducing analyst burnout. When I talk about simplifying security, I mean helping people get into security, right? Like you guys all want to do, I assume. When I worked in my last business, I think we hired probably over 100 graduates over a period of about 5 years from a mixture of Napier and Abertay. And it's something that I'm really proud of. I come from here. This is my background. So, you know, it's a big thing to me. And reducing analyst burnout. As I said, I started as a SOC analyst, and I worked as a senior analyst, a consultant, and a SOC manager, all in the operations space. I know what it's like to be drowning in work. So if I can be a part of the solution to that, then I absolutely want to be. Currently working as a senior consultant at DevNow Security, Mendon, who just spoke to you there, told you a little bit about the company. I do SOC advisory at the moment and work with customers, helping them mature and improve their services. So the whole premise of this presentation, I want to talk about the challenges we face as an industry. I've split them into 3 different spaces. We've got skill, staff, and complexity. NCSC done some interesting research this year, and they came out that 44% of all UK businesses have a basic cybersecurity gap, which is almost half, right? That's a lot. And not cumulative to that, but in addition to that, 27% of businesses have advanced skill gaps. So the result of this is the skill shortage means that what we have is businesses that are struggling to adapt to emerging threats. And the threat landscape is constantly changing, right? So it's important that businesses are able to keep up with that. And then we have staff. So the NCSC stated that 59% of cybersecurity teams are understaffed. And what that results in is what I talked about, analyst burnout, high turnover of staff, loss of skill. And then as a result, what businesses will tend to do is they'll have a reliance on things like automation to try and offset that loss of people. And quite often what you find is, whilst I think there is a place for automation in cybersecurity, it can affect investigation quality and decisions. And then finally, you have complexity. So this kind of compounds on what we've already talked about. You have tool sprawl. So as companies struggle to try and cover themselves, they'll invest in more and more tools. But quite often what will happen is they'll buy these tools, maybe they'll have professional services come in to configure them, and then they'll never get touched again. So what you end up with is increased false positives on alerts, which puts your team under even more pressure. You end up with fragmented data pipelines as well. So you have different tools generating different pieces of data. Some of that might be ingested in your SIEM environment, some of it might not. Some of you might be aware of the tools that are being used and other people might not. So what this creates is an issue for companies. And I think ultimately, though, what this is these are symptoms of a bigger issue. And I think a lot of this comes down to cybersecurity strategy as well. As well as that, we have a gap in the industry. So we have what service providers may promise and what the reality of that actually is. Quite often when you speak to managed service providers in the industry, they'll talk about how they want to be an extension of your team. From my experience, that's actually quite hard. In my last business, at its peak, we were working with 35 different customers. It's hard to be an extension of 35 different companies' teams. I describe working for a managed service provider as looking from the outside into a business. So you can only get so much business context. And the only way you can truly achieve proper context in a business is by working very, very closely with them. But if you're spread across a lot of customers, that's hard to achieve. Tailored solutions for your business. So quite often they'll say, we have this great product, it's specifically for you, it's going to be excellent, we're going to deploy it. But what I tend to have found working where I did before, but also working with other businesses, is that it's quite often standardized content that's reused across multiple clients. I'm going to drive that home in later slides, how that doesn't work and why it's important that it is truly standardized. We have proprietary detection platforms. Quite often that leads to, the reality of that is that quite often that leads to customers feeling trapped in relationships because they don't want to move away, because if they do, they'll lose that proprietary detection platform, and therefore the little insight they have, they feel like they'll lose. Continuous proactive hunting, but the reality of that is that quite often it's reactive, post-incident, or in retaliation to an audit. Although places that I have worked previously have done that very well, actually. And long-term strategy. So they'll talk of having a long-term strategy, but I tend to find when working with service suppliers, what you actually have is we're talking weeks and months instead of a 3, 6, 9, 12 month sort of strategy. So I talked about the importance of tailored cybersecurity, and I wanted to use this slide to drive that home. So these are some of the companies that I've defended in the past 12 years. It's only a handful. There was a lot more than that. But the reason I bring this up is, one, there will be logos on there that I imagine everybody in this room recognizes. But two, all of these businesses are different. None of them are the same. They work in different sectors and industries, and they face different challenges. So it's important for these companies to have a tailored approach as opposed to a standardized approach. So, for example, if you're deploying a rule that looks at brute force and its metric is 10 failed logins, what are you actually looking for there? How does that relate to that business? You know, you've got businesses here that are critical national infrastructure, you know, water, finance, lots and lots of different things, and they all have different challenges. There's a couple of logos up there that one of the biggest things they dealt with was credential stuffing, because they were a popular service. So I don't work with them, so I can name them. Just Eat and Deliveroo were the people that struggled with credential stuffing. The reason for that was that everyone in here likely has an account for them, like I said. If you have a data breach and you want to validate that data breach, the best way to do that is to run those credentials against a popular service. And basically what you can say is, I'm confident that 70% of the accounts in this breach will work if you buy this from me. So it wasn't so much targeting them, it was using them to prove a point, but it would affect their availability. Then you have other logos on there, like financial logos. Their availability might be attacked, but that's for a different reason. They may host critical services that if they're down, people are frustrated if they can't access them. So where do we start? Where do we start to try and unpick this problem? Well, for me, it comes from threat, and we have to understand our adversaries before we can do anything. There's a great practitioner called Stuart Bertram who does a course on ArcX, if anybody's interested, for threat intelligence. and he dubs this as the unholy trinity. So we've got nation-states, cybercriminals, and hacktivists. Split these into three distinct areas: motivation, capability, and intent. Motivation is simply the reason they get out of bed in the morning. Capability is their ability to be able to conduct what they're trying to conduct. And intent is their sort of long-term goal. Like, if they got to that point, they may stop doing what they're doing. So for nation-states, that tends to be sort of political and strategical influence. They're looking to destabilise. Their capability tends to be quite high. They're well-resourced, well-financed. And their intent is long-term disruption, data theft, and intelligence gathering. Cybercriminals are totally different. Their motivation is purely money. Their capability tends to be moderate. I find that's probably because, moderate to advanced, and I tend to find that's probably because they're making money, so they can invest money in better tactics and techniques. And their intent is to steal, extort, and sell data. Hacktivists, their motivation is ideological and social causes. Their capability kind of varies. I guess it depends what they have access to. They'll usually use publicly available tools, sort of almost like living off the land. And their intent is to disrupt, deface, and sort of embarrass. You tend to find with people like that, the mere mention of money actually makes them more angry. So to take that a step further, in 2013, a group of researchers done a paper for the Department of Defence around looking at adversaries and how we can kind of break this up. And they came up with something called the diamond model. The diamond model splits these into three different sectors. You have adversaries, capabilities, victims, and infrastructure. Now, with threat intelligence, the idea is to propose here that these have subcategories within them. So under adversaries, they split things out into things like motives, skills, and resources, which kind of ties back into the last slide. Then you've got capabilities, and in those capabilities, you're looking at things like tools, techniques, things like that. For victims, we're looking at organizations, users, and systems that are being targeted. And for infrastructure, you're looking at things like servers and domains and compromised hosts. So the idea would be, if you're collecting your threat intelligence data, to try and align it to this and tag the data, and it makes it easier to then search. So we talked a little bit about, I talked a little bit about threat intelligence, data gathering there and tagging it using the diamond model. But I guess we need to discuss how you turn that data into intelligence. So actually, it was when I studied here, I actually thought that data and information were kind of synonymous. They're not. I done a course, I can't remember what the module was, but it was with a lecturer called Jyoti Bajwar, I don't know if she's still here, where she talked about the difference between data and information. But in the context of this, what we're actually talking about is, people might think that, for example, an IP address as an IOC on its own is a piece of intelligence, but it's actually data. There needs to be more done for you to be able to get more out of that. So in terms of information, if we took an IP address, we might want to enrich that further by looking up on services like VirusTotal to understand its reputation. Or we want to take that IP and look up who is information to understand if it's tied to a domain and who owns that domain. And then to take that to the next step and turn that into a piece of intelligence, you might take that information then and you might use it to search in your environment to understand where that appears. And maybe when you do that search, you see, for example, that IP address has been attempting to brute force into accounts in your Office 365 tenancy. You may then look at your threat intelligence platform, and you might be able to link that information that you've pulled together and find that it's linked to a threat actor group that's targeting financial industries, for example, and you might be in the financial industry. And based on that, you're able to take that piece of data and you're able to turn it into a piece of intelligence that's actionable. On the right, it's on your left, but it's on my right, there's an arrow there that says collection, process, and analysis, which takes us nicely into the next slide, which is intelligence cycles. So this is a process for gathering, analysing, and applying intelligence in businesses. So if I take you through a scenario, for example, for planning and direction, if you say a business is being, for example, targeted for business email compromise, there may be a question around why is it that we keep getting targeted by these threat actors using this attack? How can we defend ourselves against it? And the idea is that you use this cycle to be able to go and collect and disseminate the information. So at the collection stage, what we'd be looking at is we may ask questions around, well, do we have the telemetry to be able to look for this activity? So what we might want to do is go and pull in email logs. We might want to look at sign-in logs and pull them into something like a SIEM environment. We would want to onboard it, parse it, and normalize that data, which is the processing element there. And then for analysis, once you have that data and it's been onboarded and normalized, you can start to analyze it. You can start to search that data to understand and look for patterns. Like I said in the last slide, as an example, let's say that you start to notice things like people trying to get into your accounts from a certain IP address, that you're receiving phishing emails, for example, and they're of the same template. They're coming from the same domain. These are patterns that you can start to pull from the data. And once you've built that and you've got that intelligence and you understand that, you can then action that intelligence. So what you're looking at that stage is, well, what's the next step? What do we do with this intelligence? So I mentioned things like phishing emails there. You might want to update your appliance that looks at catching phishing emails. You might want to reach out to your IT team and block the domains that are appearing in those phishing emails. You might want to do user awareness training, right? If it's a BEC attack and your directors are being targeted, you might want to make them aware of what they're being targeted for and how that looks. So at this point, we're starting to build what I like to call an enterprise profile. I haven't really touched so much on the context side of things, but previously, when I've worked with threat, what we've done is we've split companies into industries. And we tend to find that companies don't just sit in one area, they'll sit across multiple. So some customers that I've worked for in the past, for example, aviation. Aviation, weirdly, was obviously travel, but it used to kind of almost edge into the financial industry. They had massive problems with bonus reward schemes. So when you buy flights, you get money, you get points to go towards other flights. They had problems with people laundering money, basically paying for those points. So they had issues in the financial area. But also there's other elements to consider there. There's geopolitics as well. So I've worked with companies that are retail predominantly, but they do manufacturing in China. So that affects how you look at them from a threat perspective. For an example, one of the things that we used to have as an alert would be logins from a high-risk country, for example. For most of our customers that we worked with at the time, China would be high risk. But taking that business context into consideration, you'd be like, no, well, of course they've got people based out in China. They do manufacturing in China. But that opens them to other threats that some companies might not have because they work in that area. And then we're able to use the threat actor metadata, so the intelligence that we've collected and enriched. And then finally, we're able to pass that on to our detection engineering team, and I'm going to touch on that in later slides, where basically they're able to map TTPs to the MITRE ATT&CK framework and hopefully have high fidelity, good rules that will create alerts. So this is how I propose that we defend the problem, right? So we've talked about threat. I had to talk about threat as an introduction to get us to this point. But around that, we have PDR. People here might recognize protect, detect, and respond. It makes up an element of the NISP cybersecurity framework. I think for the cybersecurity framework, they have governance. I think it's inventory, protect, detect, respond. You're shaking your head, is that wrong? And recovery, I think, is the final one. But in the scope of what I'm talking about today, protect, detect, and respond are the elements that are the key parts. So for protect, that's about onboarding devices and vulnerability management and being able to use that context in terms of how we protect organizations. For detect, it's translating threat intelligence into the sort of valid, resilient detections that we want to see. And to drive that home, high fidelity is so important, or it doesn't help with the premise of the challenges we're facing. because again, like I said, we're looking to reduce analyst burnout, and Respond is about using automation, intelligence, and AI to not replace SOC analysts, but to leverage the capability so that we can respond faster. I'll talk about that later on in the presentation, but I still believe that humans are very much at the centre of a security operations centre. So that takes us into MITRE frameworks. I'm not sure if you guys will have heard of MITRE attack and defence before, but basically MITRE attack is the ability to map adversaries' behaviours. It gives us a common language to describe what they're doing, and we break that down into tactics, techniques, and procedures, and it enables mapping of real-time threat behaviours. And it highlights coverage gaps, which is super important for us as I take you on the example that we've got coming up, because what it does is it allows you to reassure the business that you've got them covered. And then the kind of flip side of that is MITRE defence. So it's the tactics and techniques as defenders that we've got available to us to kind of counteract these attack techniques and tactics, techniques, and procedures. So I wanted to highlight this because it shows how they map across to each other. And in the following examples, I'm going to take you through a technique for scattered spider. So scattered spider was massive this year, right? Done some significant damage. So how this maps, so protect and the defense framework maps to harden, and these are all the different techniques as defenders we have to protect ourselves. And as I mentioned, so scattered spider earlier this year, one of the techniques that they were using was valid domain accounts. So what we're looking at here is they would use phishing to contact service desks, which I think is pretty well known, and they would convince them to reset passwords on accounts or reset MFA tokens. So in terms of protect, how that maps and what we can do as defenders is we're looking at agent authentication and changing default passwords as a technique. And within that agent authentication, we've got examples here of enabling multi-factor authentication and using biometric authentication. So this is our response to what they're doing and how we would start to build that. And then for detect, so we've got protect, detect, and respond. For detect maps nicely to detect and the defense framework. And these are all the different techniques as defenders we have available to us as well. And how that maps to the scenario with scattered spider and the valid accounts is you'll be looking at domain account monitoring. And if we flick into here, it gives us a definition of that, which is pretty straightforward. You're just looking for changes to user accounts within your domain. But we can flip back to MITRE attack, and under detections, it tells us exactly what to look for. So you're looking for login sessions being created, login session metadata, user account authentication. And one of the reasons that I really like MITRE is a framework, so it's quite high level, but it'll start to give you ideas of syntax that you might want to use in your SIEM platform to be able to look for that. And then finally, what you want to do is that if you're in a situation where you've attempted to put protective measures in place and you have detected that somebody is targeting you, you want to be able to respond, right? So respond maps nicely in the defense framework to isolate and evict. And these are all the different tactics we have to hand to defend ourselves as defenders. And for this particular technique, what we're looking at is account lock-in, so locking the account down, and user account permissions, so reducing the permissions that an account has so someone hasn't got overly elevated permissions to cause damage. And again, the framework gives us a nice description of that. It talks about how you might achieve that and some of the considerations you want to take when you're going to perform this action. And then for response, it's pretty straightforward, right? You're looking at user account permissions. There's not much in that. It's basically reducing the surface area the account has to perform any damage. So what I guess I'm trying to highlight here is that gives us a strategy, right, for that one technique. One of the things I didn't get a chance to do is I wanted to add a slide in here of the MITRE attack framework. It has a nice heat map. So this is just one technique that Scatter Spider would use, right? So once you've done that, you would want to go back and do it for the other techniques to give yourself that coverage. And that takes us to sort of gap analysis. So detection gap analysis. So this is a sort of iterative kind of life cycle approach. So what you would want to do is you would want to identify your gaps using frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK. Once you've identified them, you would want to come up with hypotheses and create threat hunts. And what you would do is you would hunt within your network. So my background is Splunk. We use Splunk day in and day out. I worked with a threat hunting team, and their job on a day-to-day basis was coming up with hypotheses based on threat intelligence. And they would go away and they would hunt in our environment to try and find signs of that tactic or technique being exploited. If they did, and if they found something, they would raise an incident and we would investigate that incident. If they'd done that threat hunt and they found they didn't have the logs or the telemetry to complete that threat hunt, that would be passed to the engineering team, who would then onboard that data. And if we had the logs, but they didn't find signs of an exploit, but they believed that it was capable of happening in that environment, they would then take that hypothesis and they would pass it to the detection engineering team, and they would create a content detection rule for that. And like I said, this is a complete life cycle. So what I talked about with Scattered Spider there, you would go through this process, and once you've finished that technique, you go back to the start and you would pick another area on your MITRE heat map that hasn't been covered, and you would look at that and go iteratively through the process. And then once you get to detection and platform engineering, one of the things you want to do is have a life cycle for that as well. So out of the detection gap analysis, the rule will be passed into the design phase, where they'll start to construct the rule. And then after that, one of the things that I've seen that's not so great in the past is people need to validate them. So Red Canary do something called Atomic Red, which is an open source testing platform, right? I've worked with service providers and different IT outfits that have designed rules but never tested them based on research that may be done on the internet, but how do you know that when that happens that it's actually going to fire off? So Red Canary, great company, and the open source tool they have is really fantastic as well. So once you've validated that you can catch a true positive, that you can catch an attack in action, the next thing you need to do is you need to look at how you're going to tune that. And this is massive. It's so important to this part of the process. When we talk about analyst burnout, tuning should be something that's continuous on security rules. So before it even enters production, you would want to tune it in the first place, because what you tend to find is that enterprises have things in their network that you wouldn't expect. As an example off the top of my head, if you had a brute force rule, you may find that when you put it into production that it fires off 100 tickets straight away. And that's a lot of work for an analyst to go through, right? But when you look into it further, you realize that it's common within the enterprise that they embed credentials in scripts, and when the password policy requires that someone changes their password, they don't update the script, and you get lots and lots of brute forces. Not good practice, by the way, but I've seen that happen. So you need to be able to take those known things out of the rule, because you don't want that triggering off, and you don't want that stressing out your team, right? You want to see the things that are actual attacks. And then finally, if the intelligence indicates as such, you want to be able to retire a rule. So in my last job, the last few months of my job, we had a customer who had a rule looking for log4j, which is a very, very old vulnerability. Very old, 2021, I think now. As far as we were aware, from speaking to the vulnerability team, they'd been patched, but they still kept the rule in production, and it used to fire off a lot of false positives. So if you have the intelligence to suggest that you are covered, you want to retire that rule. One of the great things about it is, I'm not talking about deleting it, is retiring it. I had a conversation with a colleague recently at DevNull where we talked about this. And he said, what if somebody uses a gold image that has a vulnerability on it and it gets reintroduced to the network? Well, that's the beauty of this, right? You have vulnerability management, and that feeds into your threat intelligence platform. You'll get notified that a device has appeared on the network that has that vulnerability. You've not deleted the rule, you've retired it. So as a stopgap until someone fixes that, you can put that rule back into production. You've done the work on it already, you've done the design, you've validated it, you've tuned it, so you're confident that you can put that back in straight away and it's going to work, right, until you're able to resolve that vulnerability. So finally, I wanted to talk a bit about the evolution of security operations, and this kind of ties into the response element of it. Like I said, I've worked in cybersecurity for over 12 years now, and when I started, a lot of it was compliance-based. I'd done a lot of Sarbanes-Oxley compliance stuff, and that sort of drove security, that sort of pushed businesses towards security, because they realised that they could do their compliance, but they could also get that reassurance of having a security team. Anyone that doesn't know about Sarbanes-Oxley, look it up. WorldCon, Enron, interesting stuff. Got lost down a rabbit hole when I was introduced to that, but that's by the by. So from there, I worked a lot on compliance and data sampling. It was tremendously tedious. It was a lot of copying and pasting. It was working in Excel spreadsheets. But ultimately, even though it was Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, it was looking at things like login failures, account changes and stuff. So it did have that element of starting to move in the direction of security. Then the next evolution of that was I was introduced to SIEM tools, QRadar, which I wasn't a fan of, and I'm glad to see that that's disappearing now with Palo Alto buying them over and absorbing it into Cortex. And we had ticketing as well. So like I said before, everything I'd done was in a spreadsheet, and it was all copy and paste. It was a lot of hard, monotonous work. So that next step in the evolution was welcomed. And then I'd say probably around 2018-ish, started to see the emergence of automation and SOAR tools. So I worked with Splunk Phantom, and what that did was it had done a lot of enrichment and automation for us. It would respond on our behalf. It would reach out to customers, really good stuff. And then the next stage of that is agentic AI for me, right? That's where we're moving to next. And it's a big topic. Everyone has some pretty strong opinions on it, I understand. My opinion on it is it has a place in cybersecurity, but it doesn't replace people. What we're starting to see now is adversaries are also making use of AI as well, and we need to mirror how they're using it. So how they'll use it is they'll use AI to do things like the reconnaissance for them, to do vulnerability research. But when it comes down to it, the hands-on keyboard part, it's still very much a person, right? We mirror that in a security operation environment by doing things like having AI summarize investigations for us, right? So instead of having to look through screens and screens of data, it tells you what the investigation's about. We can use it to enrich investigations, right? So it can go and do a lot of the things that I used to have to do manually. So I used to go out to these reputational services for IP addresses, for email addresses. I would literally go into the browser, open it up, type it in. Now we can have everything brought into one place. The last place I was working at before I finished there, an investigation would have all its enrichment in it already. We can do things like attack disruption. So it's something that I want to look into at a later date, but the idea is that actually, if you have an alert that's a high enough severity and a high enough priority, what you do is you kick that device off the network automatically, or you lock that account down automatically. And it's like a flip reverse on how we work in SOCs. Usually, or traditionally, I would get an investigation, I would investigate it, and if it was a true positive, we would take an action. But in this case, you've already contained the device, so the job of the analyst is actually to work out if it isn't a true positive so that they can then remove those controls. So yeah, that's my take on AI and how it works in cybersecurity, or how it works in a security operations sort of background. So my sort of key takeaways from today are intelligence quality over detection quantity. Worked with a lot of customers that would say to me, I've got 250 rules that are looking for different things. But you know, if you map them against frameworks like MITRE and you find out actually they only cover like 2 of the techniques of the many different techniques that are on there, you've actually not got great coverage. You've just got a lot of rules. I tried to drive home the fact that we have to have tailored cybersecurity, right? Not every enterprise is the same. So we basically can't just have that standardized approach. I'm going to bash out these 10 rules and that's you covered. Let intelligence guide your security roadmap. I hope that I put that across to you today, that if you go and start and work for a company, I don't know how close you guys are to graduating, and someone says to you, what should we do? How do we deal with this? Maybe some of the stuff I've talked about today can be used. You can think back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. You can think back to threat intelligence and the intelligence cycles and how we gathered that data and enriched it and turned it into something actionable. And then finally, we talked about AI and automation and how that enables security teams. It's not about replacing teams. So yeah.
Probably got time for one question.
Go for it.
Question? Question? Right at the back there. Almost the same.
How are you?
There we go.
I guess one guy, like, with like the first using AI well, do you worry that there's gonna be a point that we want to use human to work AI, there will be a point where a human person trying to keep on the attack too much and won't work, and that AI might be then used more and more? Or do you think we're gonna be still having human like 20, 30 years?
So sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Are you able to just?
Do you think like with like the advanced AI, with like people who are attackers using AI well, do you think it's gonna be a point where like in 20 years humans will still be involved in the process, or do you think it'll be more and more controlled by AI and like humans will be there like in the background, like in the foreground like they are now?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess, and this is my opinion, right? so take it with a pinch of salt. I read some articles recently that talked about, again, how I was talking about hands-on keyboard again, because what we start to see is those patterns are identifiable. So if attackers are using AI to perform certain actions, as defenders, we can counteract that by looking for those patterns. And I read an article a couple of months ago that was talking about there was a return to hands to keyboard because it was less predictable, right? So I still believe, to me, AI is a tool. It's not a replacement. It's something that we leverage. AI is only as good as the person that's using it, right? I don't know if anybody saw recently Coca-Cola done their advertisement. What was it? It was a ridiculous amount of prompts, right? And it looks terrible. So it's a tool. It's only as good as the person that's using it, right? So we'll always still need that human involvement. And if I come back to Napier in 2, 5, 10 years' time, I'm happy for someone in here to say, remember when you said AI wouldn't replace us? It has. But I really do think it's a tool, and that's how it will be. It could be used for attacks, but like I said, as defenders, we can counteract that by looking for those patterns.
What would be the basic skill set you would expect from the candidate at the interview?
So for me, when I was looking for SOC analysts, I was looking for foundational knowledge, right? The stuff that you guys get here. So the kind of questions that I was asking were pretty basic. Like, tell me about the CIA triad. If you can explain that to me, that's a good start. If you can tell me a little bit about networking, great start. I wasn't looking for the complete package, right? In fact, I preferred people that maybe didn't quite know but had the enthusiasm to learn. You can teach someone if they're enthusiastic, right? So I was looking for the basic knowledge you guys get here at Napier University, and if you're enthusiastic, you're willing to learn, like that's what I was looking for.
Okay, thanks. We've probably got just one little tiny question.
Now that I put my hand up, I've forgotten. Go with someone else.
Yeah, there's some good research with it. Full multi. End-to-end attacks. But AI is looking and judging how good these attacks are and mixing them up. I mean, pretty clever stuff.
And like I said, it's my opinion, so I'm happy if you've got some stuff, share it with me because I enjoy reading this stuff as well. Go ahead.
Have you attackers thinking about implementing AI in exactly the same way that modern businesses are, which is where do we find efficiencies and how can we go faster? Right. So if it is, discovering and detecting voice, if it is, empowering agentic AI with, executable code and then giving access to credentials and seeing how far it can run. Like, I think we're going to see creative uses of it, and this draws back to the fundamental asymmetries in security, which is bad guys can do anything, and the good guys know exactly everything, or should know everything in the state and how to defend it, right? And so it's an issue of, are we using the basic good practices, right, segmenting our network, restricting movement along across it, et cetera, in order to restrict AI from being able to run answers inside of us. If you have a really flat network and you're not implementing MFA, right? Somebody.
I was going to say AI is the least of your problems if you've got a flat network.
Tomorrow, your entire state is encrypted and you get ransomware everywhere, right? If you have good security fundamentals in there, the AI is going to have difficulty getting into the humans also. So.
Great. Well, thanks very much for coming along. Hopefully, we'll follow up with opportunities for jobs